what I also encounter with colleagues and friends from Southeast Asia and from with colleagues from the global South, to them, the the threat that NATO poses to Russia is quite evident, and most of them say, like, yeah, look, 1999, Serbia, Yugoslavia is not part of NATO, right? It was not NATO territory, but NATO went to
Yeah,
bomb there, and NATO
yeah,
went to bomb other places, including
yeah.
Libya. And it is, I mean, obviously, this thing will be perceived as a potential threat by the Russians. The only ones who don't see that are NATO members who keep saying we are the most
Yeah.
peace-loving military alliance in the history of military alliances. Is this intentional, like willing blindness to how others will perceive you, or is there really a mental blockade in the way that a lot of people in Europe perceive themselves, NATO?
I think it's a mental block. I think we cannot uh, begin to imagine how we look to other people because we're right. In the way Europe and America think of themselves, they are in the direct tradition of the Enlightenment, of progress, of pacifism. And standing in the way are all these bad states. These bad states are lagging behind, unfortunately, but one day they'll catch up. And anything we can do to encourage them to catch up is justified because once they have caught up and once they have accepted our values, then the world will be peaceful. So you can almost justify this blindness in terms of a peace policy, a long term peace policy to make everyone think out, everyone in the Deep South, everyone in Asia, think like us, adopt our values, and then we'll have perpetual peace. But meanwhile, you have to have lots of wars in order to get to that state of affairs. And that's where the blindness comes in, that we can't see anything from another point of view. And the point you make is perfectly right. In East Asia and over much of the global South, NATO is seen as aggressive. And the point is, NATO is a successor of all those imperial powers who dominated the rest of the world from in the 19th and early 20th century. So, of course, they see a connection. We would have had to have very, very good diplomacy to have really navigated that. But we didn't. We were careless because we won.
You put it beautifully, and I think that is exactly the problem that Europe at the moment has. It's just that it surprises me because there is a lot of good thinkers. There's a lot of people who also academics who try to look at things from different perspectives. But these days it is hard to convince anyone in Europe to actually rethink the general framing of the Ukraine war. And that's also the general framing, as you said, of this Enlightenment tradition, which obviously had so many um, negative ways of showing itself, right? And especially if you look at the way that the colonized part of the world experienced the Europeans, they experienced them as highly violent, right? Why is this part of our European history still so alien to many Europeans?
Well, you know something. I think most of the experts who pronounce on Ukraine and on international relations now are all part of the defense establishment. They're said to be independent, but they're not really. And I mean, there are a whole lot of people around whose living and influence really depends on them being connected to the defense and foreign policy establishment of the American and European countries. They're not independent, and newspapers follow that. Now, the newspaper view is very, 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 very troubling, and I don't understand quite how it works even. But every single mainstream journal fell behind the official government view and has remained so all through the war. It was you mentioned, I think, that an article I wrote in the Guardian. It was the first time I'd managed to get an article in any mainstream journal for nearly 3 years. Why was that? It's still something I think historians are going to argue about forever. There are a few independent experts and really independent thinkers, but you can almost count them on one hand. I mean, for example, one very well known one is Jeffrey Sachs, and I mean he speaks out very lucidly and courageously. He thinks America is basically to blame for all this trouble. And that doesn't make him very popular. But of course, he has a very large following. But he's genuinely independent thinker, and I can think of one or two others. But most of them are connected with the defense and foreign policy establishment. That is probably the answer. But why newspapers should have, in our country, I'm thinking of the UK, I'm not so, I don't know enough about what goes on elsewhere. I think there's more variety in some of the other European countries and even in America. But why Britain should have been so simply single scripted, and I call it warmongering.